Hi, welcome to the lecture Understanding and Controlling the Environment in Modern European History. The lecture is structured into three parts based on the standard chronology of European modernity. First discusses the early modern period, second focuses on the 19th century, and the third and last one is devoted to the 20th century developments. In early modern Europe, there were not many natural landscapes in the sense of nature untouched by man. While Europeans had been interacting with their environment since prehistory, in the early modern era, the pace and magnitude of human intervention increased. Intensified exploitation of natural resources gave rise to transformations of the environment that affected the entire continent and in some respects the world beyond Europe as well. Attitudes towards the environment also changed. Europeans increasingly felt that men should and could control and manage the natural world. The early modern era witnessed an expansion and intensification of the extraction of natural resources across the continent. This process was associated with the demographic growth and the emergence of merchant capitalism in northwestern Europe, especially the Low Countries and the London region. Expanding markets and long-distance trade sparked a large-scale commodification of nature and induced significant changes in land use patterns. Some areas in Europe soon witnessed a considerable deforestation, but European entrepreneurs were involved also in land reclamation, especially in northwestern Europe. The English fens, the Dutch polders are fine examples, and the Mediterranean, remember the Venetian lagoon, and also export new opportunities overseas. With improving sea transportation, they became able to develop plantation economies in tropical regions. The ensuing complex Columbian exchange, characterized by a mixing of the hitherto largely separated biological life of the American, African, and Eurasian continents, marked a distinctive step towards the development of a global agricultural market. As suggested by the impact of the Little Ice Age, the cool period in early modern Europe, the environment of early modern Europe could pose a risk to human lives and livelihoods, just as well as it could provide essential resources. Although these risks often originated in natural phenomena such as the weather, storms, floods and droughts, seismic activity, or biological incidents, their ultimate impact depended on the interaction between man and the environment. In fact, many risks were caused, or at least exacerbated, by human exploitation of natural resources. In 15th and 16th century Holland, for instance, digging peat for fuel created large inland lakes that eroded the shoreline during inclement weather. Early modern societies responded to environmental risk in various ways, employing both new and traditional methods. They anticipated recurrence and adjusted to the situation, but also tried to reduce threats by actively transforming the environment. The development of flood defenses in Holland is a good example. Especially between 1550 and 1660, large areas were reclaimed and transformed into agricultural land. Funding was often provided by merchant companies, while technological expertise increasingly came from qualified surveyors trained at technical schools. Early modern societies experienced a dramatic technological change intricately linked to their increasing control over the environment. Two major lines of development were important. First, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century led to a more comprehensive and precise grasp on the environment. Second, this process was embedded in the large context of empire and conquest. The discovery of America is just as much a part of this story as the technological penetration of the hitherto sparsely explored European peripheries. New scientific methods and bodies of knowledge, as well as new scientific discoveries and associated technology, aided the control and exploitation of the environment to a previously unforeseen extent. Some of these works were great feats of engineering, such as the Canal du Midi between the Atlantic Ocean near Toulouse and the Mediterranean Sea near Vauban, completed in 1681. The intensification of land use, the transformation of environments and more sophisticated extraction of natural resources, which characterized the early modern era, were accompanied by a change in statehood and state power. Early modern forestry provides a good example. The introduction of rational forest management in the 17th and 18th century owed much to attempts to supplement state revenues. In the early modern period, the theology of nature was the dominant discourse regarding the relation between man and environment. Nature was considered God's creation, and natural disasters were seen as an expression of God's punitive wrath, or as his warning to compel people to change their behavior. It would be wrong to think that the scientific revolution produced a discourse of rationalism that was antagonistic to this providentialism. Nevertheless, attitudes changed from the late 17th century onwards. In the context of early hygienism, the social image of nature evolved. In Great Britain, for instance, the aristocracy left the dirty city for the safe countryside, and all over Europe the mountains, which had long been rejected, became fashionable for their supposed therapeutic virtues. In the second half of the 18th century, we can observe the first signs of a growing awareness of the need to preserve nature for its own sake. This awareness grew in the European tropical colonies after establishment of plantation economy. In Mauritius in 1769, the French botanist and colonial administrator Pierre Poivre led an environmental moral economy based on a policy of forest conservation and the acclimatization of new plants to put an end to the destruction of nature. Confronted with resource scarcity, industrialization, and colonial expansion and exploitation, Europeans in the 19th century conceptualized and experienced the natural world in new ways. From the 18th century onwards, there emerged two distinct views of nature, which environmental historian Donald Worcester has called imperial and Arcadian. The imperial tradition gave mankind authority over all living creatures. This human-centered view, most strongly expressed in Carl Linnæus' Systema Naturae, published in 1735, provided a rationale for ever-increasing state intervention in managing natural resources. Below the surface, however, a parallel Arcadian tradition imagined, in the word of Worcester, a simple, humble life for man with the aim of restoring him to a peaceful coexistence with other organisms. Embodied in Gilbert White's The Natural History of Antiquities of Selborne, published in 1789, the Arcadian view assigned man a moral responsibility to take good care of God's creation. This trend of thought gained momentum in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and shaped the early conservation movement that emerged at the end of the 19th century. Fundamental to imperial view of nature was a conceptual division between the natural world and human society. Modern science and technology played a crucial role in constructing and further deepening this dualism. The first stage of this process can be described as concerned with mapping the world and focused on the observation and classification of nature. This developed into a second stage, in which scientists directly focus on the exploitation of nature. In the early 19th century, scientific understanding shifted towards seeing nature as a dynamic result of competition between various actors and elements, which needed to be dominated by humans and cultivated into a dependable economic resource. The conceptual division between the natural world and the human society provided monarchies throughout Europe with a rationale to intensify centralized efforts to regulate scarce natural resources. The results of these trends were manifold. Scientific forestry again represents a perfect example. Besides producing monocultural, even age and geometrically ordered landscapes, it affected customary systems of tenancy and property. Suppression of communal forms of landholding became widespread throughout Europe. Their destruction had environmental consequences, for instance, rapid reduction of biodiversity. The industrialization process in the long 19th century had far-reaching impact on the natural environment. The Industrial Revolution marked a fundamental turning point in the history of the relationship between humans and nature. Factories drained, polluted, or even poisoned waters in nearby rivers and seas, or emitted heavily polluted air due to the combustion of coal. These hazards caused health problems among people and animals living in close proximity to industrial areas. Environmental problems like the so-called smoke pest or smoke plague, sulfured air and toxic water became vital issues, especially in cities, in which people had also suffered from pest, cholera, and other epidemics like typhus. The situation stimulated scientific research and legal regulation. In the 1860s, Britain, the first country to address at full scale the environmental effects of industrialization, passed the so-called Alkali Act to regulate emissions from the chemical industry. Gradually, other pieces of legislation were introduced, but most of the industrial countries did not follow Britain's path before the interwar period. Simultaneously, a broad social movement calling for better protection of public health or nature preservation emerged. By the end of the 19th century, rapid environmental changes led to the idea that the natural world was a fragile and interconnected system that needed protection. It was in the European colonies overseas that scientists from Europe for the first time experienced how human expansion and activities degraded a natural beauty. Because of their surveyable size, tropical islands provided sites ideally suited for botanical research, and it was here that ideas about ecological connections were first envisioned. It was in the colonies, too, that enlightened administrators applied forest and soil conservation measures for the first time in the 1850s. At the end of the 19th century, two broader developments led to the foundation of the first nature conservation organizations in Europe itself. First, natural history became a popular pastime and stimulated a desire to protect rare and disappearing plant and animal species. Second, middle-class reformers, including many women, started a campaign against cruelty to animals. For example, the Bund for Vogelschutz, established in Germany in 1899. Over the course of the 20th century, Europeans, the European environment, and their mutual relationship underwent dramatic changes. The acceleration of industrialization at the turn of the century amplified existing problems like water and air pollution. So, too, did two catastrophic world wars, which dramatically affected humans and their environment. As the Cold War developed, Europe was separated into two opposing blocs, communist and capitalist democratic states. As much as these two were ideologically opposed, both sides still shared a strong faith in planning and development. Before the Second World War, industrialization, mining, and urbanization had already visibly depleted particular natural resources and destroyed parts of the natural landscape. After 1945, the threatening impact of Fordist capitalism on the environment was apparent, as mass production and mass consumption necessitated extractive processes throughout the world. The new biotechnological model of agriculture, developed in Europe, was eventually exported to Asia and Africa under the label of the Green Revolution in the 1960s. It had a large impact in agro-environmental terms. Local varieties, well adapted to local conditions, were replaced and often disappeared entirely. Beyond agriculture, biodiversity in general suffered as well. Living organisms of all types were destroyed by pesticides, and the increased use of fertilizers polluted underground and surface waters. The internationalization of productive and commercial chains, especially after the 1970s, fostered new transformations in the types of technology created for agrarian production. This was the continuation of a trend which can be traced back to the 18th century and, on a large scale, to the age of empire. The split between places of consumption and production thus contributed to the concentration of environmental degradation and enabled Europeans to export their environmental costs. With the recognition of the growing complexity of environmental issues faced by rapidly industrializing countries in the 20th century, as we demonstrated in the case of the agricultural sector, science and scientific expertise played ever more dominant roles in both environmental management and public debate. Growing armies of engineers and scientists within state bureaucracies served the state's mission to outpace other nations in mobilizing national natural resources with the aim of maximizing output. States used the power of science and technology to subdue the natural environment and thereby legitimate their power and their existence. As a radical version of modernist technocratic ideology, Soviet communism indeed identified applied science as a crucial instrument for the transformation of both man and nature. The famous motto of Russian agricultural scientist Ivan Michurin captured these feelings clearly. We cannot expect favors from nature. It is our job to take them from her. Following such a motto, the Soviet Union attempted a bold, large-scale environmental transformation scheme known as Stalin's Plan for the Transformation of Nature. When the USSR faced extreme drought under Stalin in the late 1940s, experts developed a plan to redirect water streams from the southern USSR in order to change local climates and soils elsewhere, and also to enable the growth of forests and the agricultural use of the country's arid steppes. However, science simultaneously helped to undermine faith in the omnipotence of human reason. From the 1950s onward, voices emphasizing a cautious approach to the environment moved slowly from dissent to the mainstream. As environmental problems are borderless, societies increasingly recognized that they were interdependent. 19th century nature protection societies regarded both nation-states and the international system as relevant arenas for action. The interwar period even fostered their direct engagement in international politics through the League of Nations, which provided the first bureaucratic infrastructure for international environmentalism. However, it was not until after the Second World War that ecological issues became the object of intense political contention. Concerned scientists like American Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring led to the banning of dangerous pesticides, helped place certain problems on the political agenda. One key turning point at the international level was the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, which took place in Stockholm in 1972. Most of the Western and former Third World countries took part in the Stockholm Conference, but the Soviet Union and its allies mainly boycotted it for the Cold War diplomatic reasons. At the conference, the UN established its environmental program, which is now based in Nairobi, Kenya. The conference in 1972 was also a starting point for the establishment of national environmental institutions, like ministries or agencies, as well as international environmental diplomacy. In the last 3 decades of the 20th century, several international conventions on protection of environment were adopted. The Second Worldwide United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 enshrined the concept of sustainable development in international law. A direct, successful consequence of this conference was the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, a major diplomatic contribution to the fight against global warming. Environmentalism was not, however, simply a question of science or a matter of high international politics, but a set of concerns that also animated social movements across Europe and beyond. Especially the finite supply of natural resources in Europe and the wider world called into question the sustainability of post-war industrial society. Following Rachel Carson's critique of industrial society in 1972, a widely publicized study on the limits of growth appeared, which used computer modeling to show how exponential growth in human consumption would quickly outstrip the planet's ability to replenish itself. As economic globalization accelerated in the early 1970s, environmental problems came to be perceived in relation to a global whole. By the 1970s, the human relationship to the environment became increasingly politicized. Among environmental issues, nuclear energy became one of the most contentious. Wherever nuclear facilities were proposed, concerned citizens protested in opposition to them. In 1986, the Chernobyl accident underscored the dangers that activists had been opposing for more than a decade. In Eastern Europe, environmentalism as a political movement developed somewhat later, but drew on some of the same impulses that had animated protests in Western Europe. By the 1990s, environmentalism had become a professionalized domain of protest. Faced with government and industry-backed experts supportive of nuclear energy, environmentalists developed their own counter-expertise, contributing to the pluralization, popularization, and contestation of scientific knowledge in the late 20th century. In several countries, they also formed political parties specifically focused on environmental issues. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. Bye.